More dairy producers are looking at taking on satellite locations as a way to grow their dairy farming businesses, whether it's a turnkey purchase to scale the business without the cost and red tape of a new build, or a lease agreement to serve as a short-term step in expanding their home site. But not every opportunity is the best strategic move. So what are the big questions you should be asking yourself and your team if you are eyeing up another dairy down the road, or even in a different state? And what if you are on the other side? You own a dairy and are considering renting it or leasing it to someone else? Well, that's what we are digging into today on the Up-Level Dairy Podcast. This is the podcast for dairy farm owners, managers, and advisors who are committed to profitability, sustainability, and excellence. I'm Peggy Coffeen, and it's my mission to bring you the conversations that will up-level your skill set and your mindset so you can be a top performer in the dairy farming business. Before you take on that second dairy site, there are 4 key areas that can make or break the long-term viability and profitability of this decision. These are the real questions you should be asking, and here to walk us through them today is Curtis Gerrits, Senior Dairy Lending Specialist with Compeer Financial. He has been having these conversations on a weekly basis with dairy clients, and you today get access to hear what he's been talking about, and you are going to gain some high-value insights for your own decision-making on whether to purchase, lease, or pass up an opportunity to take on an additional site for your dairy. This episode is sponsored by Compeer Financial, a member-owned farm credit cooperative serving and supporting agriculture and rural America. Their dairy team brings world-class expertise and tailored solutions to support dairy producers' financial goals and lending needs. You can find their contact information in our show notes. So grab a notepad and jot down these 4 key areas with Curtis Gerrits. So Curtis, to start out, you are seeing in the field that this is a leading conversation coming up with your dairy clients, considering purchasing or leasing or somehow getting involved in a second site or multiple sites for their dairy farming business. So what do you see out there, and what is leading to this trend in the field?
Hey, great question, and thanks for having me on board, Peggy. It's always great to talk with you. You know what? It's been a tremendous amount of activity as of recent, talking with some of our clients and non-clients out in the dairy industry on what their next step is for their dairy operation. And we're all aware, the cost of construction to build something new, some of the intricacies with updating your CAFO permits on your own site to allow for an expansion, and what other kind of potential capacities that your milk processor has for taking on any more milk from your operation starts to kick off those conversations of, boy, should we try to expand something on our home dairy site, or do we need to look somewhere else? And where is that other place to expand?
Yeah, so really some key factors that are strong in the marketplace right now, as you mentioned, Curtis. And, one of those obviously is milk market and milk plant capacity. The other one is the cost to build something new. And also, that challenge of looking at how do we grow and expand and scale our dairy farming business, especially if you want to really double down and invest more in being a dairy producer. And so with that in mind, Curtis, I know there are 4 key areas that you really focus on when you sit down and have these conversations at the desk and at the office with some of the most progressive dairy farmers and dairy farming families in the country that you're working with. And so what do you see as those 4 key areas of focus as you lead these conversations and walk through the decision-making process of whether it is a good business decision to buy, to lease, or to maybe even pass up an opportunity when something comes available close by to be able to expand your dairy operation?
When we're having these conversations, there's always, like you mentioned, there's 4 topics that kind of come up time and time again. It's kind of the consistent messages, the consistent topics of conversations that come up. The obvious first one is financial feasibility. So it doesn't really matter if you are buying the next TMR mixer, buying the next chunk of land, or expanding your dairy. We really need to work through, what does this mean for your bottom line? And there's really 2 key areas of that. It's the balance sheet. Can the balance sheet physically afford it? Are you going to get pinned in the corner on day one by expanding? Or can your balance sheet support it, and it's going to be your assets will well outweigh your liabilities and not pin you in the corner, so that after you do this next step, can you do the next one after that? The second piece that goes right hand in hand with that on the financial side of things is the cash flow. Ultimately, does this opportunity better your cost of production? Sometimes it doesn't. And that's okay because you need to make an informed decision. If it doesn't, that's probably one of those things that maybe you should kind of take a look at and say, you know what, if this is going to help my bottom line, help me be more profitable, it might make more sense just to walk away from the opportunity.
What you just mentioned there with really looking at the impact on the bottom line and cost of production, let's just take a half step back and say, how important is it for dairy producers right now more than ever to know that number? Are those conversations that you're having at a higher level and more intently and with more intensity these days?
Every single day, whether it be on the phone or a face-to-face meeting with our producers, the cost of production, knowing your numbers. In fact, when we analyze and look at the financial history, I mean, when we do an underwriting do an annual review for a dairy client, the one key factor that always stands out in the dairies that are successful over year is they understand their numbers with a very high amount of security and intensity, quite frankly. They can pick apart their numbers, and that is a huge thing for dairies. I mean, it's these operations today, dairy farms, they're huge businesses, right? And even a family-owned dairy that's been in the family for years, they've got a lot of dollars put into their operation, and they need to understand their numbers. And when they do understand their numbers, it really does shine in their bottom line.
One of those things that you then step into as you're really analyzing that financial feasibility is analyzing also the pros and cons of the efficiencies that could be captured or could be lost with a second site. So walk us through what those conversations have been looking like.
Absolutely. Yeah. So when these second site operations are taken into consideration, the owners, the person that wants to buy the next operation or take a look at it, one thing that they really got to do is after they start to calculate the cost of production and look at the balance sheet, the next thing that they're diving into is, can I physically do this? Do I have the team in place to do it? Is the dairy a half mile away where I can gain some efficiencies by sharing some equipment? Or is it a couple of states away? And now I got to think about, how do I have a team remote and how do we communicate back and forth? And for dairies, especially with their first, let's call it satellite site, their second dairy that's not right there, that's a true testament as to how they are able to manage their dairy operation and the trust that they have to, quite frankly, put on their team to be able to run that when they can't be the boots on the ground in both places at the same time.
We've addressed the side of being the producer that's looking to grow and expand in this way. But then there's the other side. There is the side of the seller or potential person that would be leasing a dairy out to someone else. And so what do those conversations look like?
It's not just the buyer that's at the table, right? It takes a buyer and a seller. And one of the things to take into consideration is, what's the motives of the seller? Are they just looking to walk away lock, stock, and barrel and take a check and hand off the dairy operation? There's potential to that, but a lot of times, again, in today's world, the sellers, for the most part, are sitting in a good financial position, and to sell their entire dairy operation lock, stock, and barrel likely means a pretty large tax consequence for them as well. Now, there's certainly producers that are okay with that, sellers that are like, you know what, I'm ready to sell and it's my time and this is what my goals were in establishing my dairy business. But again, for the most part, there's times where those dairies that are looking to sell are going, I don't want to take a big check right off the bat. Maybe I should rent out my dairy facility and sell my cattle, my equipment, and my feed. Or kind of the same scenario, they will enter into a lease. Now, that makes kind of an interesting situation because we talk about partnerships a lot. And even though the buyer coming in may be running the dairy themselves, they, in a sense, now have a partner. They might not have a financial tie to one another and will either take in the gains from being a profitable dairy business with one another, but they do need to be working hand in hand together. And you can't just turn a blind eye to that and think that, you know what, it's going to be totally fine. And I'm just going to be running this dairy like it's my own, because it may not be. It's somebody else's that you're going to be renting.
So, as a lender, when you come into a scenario and a producer is having this conversation about leasing a dairy, leasing an existing dairy, and what are the questions that you ask them or provoke in their minds to really make sure that they have a solid plan for how this interaction will work between the current owner of the facility and the person that's coming in to do a lease?
Yeah, the seller really needs to ask a lot of questions. Some of the main things that come up right off the get-go is who's going to be responsible for any kind of repairs on the facilities, who's going to be responsible for the taxes, the utilities, things of that nature, the day-to-day type stuff. The other piece, which can get to be a little bit uncomfortable, but is a very fair question, is that the seller, or excuse me, the buyer should be asking the seller is, what's going to be your day-to-day involvement, and do you have expectations? Will you be walking around the dairy on a regular basis? How are we going to interact if there's something that you don't maybe agree with, but it's in the best interest of my dairy operation? So there's a lot of those things that need to get handled right off the bat. There's certainly going to be instances that you probably didn't think of that do come up along the way. But I think in going into a quote unquote partnership like that, the table's got to get completely cleared so everybody has set expectations going into what that operation is going to look like moving forward.
Yeah, because these are as much as they're financial decisions for a producer that has been tied to a dairy for sometimes their entire life or family history. It's an emotional change too for that seller. You talked a little bit also, Curtis, about doing kind of some partial leasing or partial purchasing of assets. So you work with a lot of dairy producers. Compeer at large is working with producers, dairy clients across the region in making these decisions. What are some of the different scenarios that you've seen with whether it's a full out lease or partial lease or partial purchase or long-term buyout? What's working out there in the field?
That spectrum is pretty large. But what we are seeing, and has kind of been a little bit of a trend, is kind of a purchase or a lease that is staged in a couple of different processes over a period of time. For instance, they may come into an operation where the buyer purchases the cattle, the equipment, and the feed, and that's it. And they enter into a lease agreement. And a lot of times that lease agreement it's a lease to buy. So we're seeing a principal reduction based on those lease payments. So let's just say said dairy that's getting sold will start at a certain number, and after 5 years, the agreement may be that, hey, after 5 years, here's going to be your monthly payments. And after those 5 years, the seller may take off an amount, almost like the seller was the banker, right? So they're holding that asset and kind of almost acting like a financial institution themselves. Now, that can be extremely beneficial for the buyer because when you talk about stressing a balance sheet, they don't have to take that large purchase on, which quite frankly sometimes is the largest purchase as a whole when entering into a new operation. So that helps them phase into it, help build their balance sheet back up so that when they are ready to ultimately end the lease and enter into a full purchase of the site, their balance sheet has regained its healthiness, so to speak. They're off and running once they're ready to purchase that dairy. We're also seeing where the seller may have another generation that just maybe isn't quite ready to take a step into owning the dairy themselves as well. So now all of a sudden you start to see a partnership there as well, where an existing established dairy comes in and purchases, and they essentially create a new entity with a couple of new partners. And quite frankly, that's a great way to bring in that next generation that, let's face it, we all know that they just don't have the longevity and balance sheets that are out there that these established dairies do. It's a great way to bring them into the industry to help them become our next generation dairy farmers.
Yeah, so a second site in some cases can be a step in the process of a transition plan or a growth plan in the family dairy farming business.
Absolutely, and we all know because that's always been a hot topic of conversation in the dairy industry across the country is our next generation. As dairy farms are consolidating, there's just not as many dairy driveways out there. That's just kind of the reality of it, which is making it harder for that next generation to find an operation if that is their passion and they want to run a dairy facility. That's where we're starting to see some of these partnerships take shape because we have a boatload of talent out there in that next generation, whether might be on the financial side of things, the cow side of things, the agronomy side of things, and it only makes sense to partner them up to play off of one another's strengths.
Yeah, some great ambition, some great talent, as you said, coming up in a next generation of people that want to be in dairy production as their business. And we talked about one of the barriers to entry that bringing on a second site can solve, and that is facilities, and that's being able to work that into a bigger long-term plan. But one of the other barriers to entry is the ability to have a market for milk. And so talk about the seller's perspective on if they own a base through their milk processor or co-op. What does that look like, and how do they work that into these agreements?
For the most part, that's something that, especially in the upper Midwest, our dairies didn't really have to think about in the past as, hey, when I sell the dairies, I'm going to sell my cattle equipment and feed and base. We know that there's a market out there for it, especially with processors having those base programs in play just to help with the milk inflow coming on so from their capacity as to what they can produce on a daily level. So when a seller is ready to take that next step, they now have the opportunity to consider, what is my base worth? Do I have base? Does my milk plant that I ship to take that into consideration? So the seller's got to take kind of a hard look as to what is that worth. And even from the buyer's perspective, they got to now take that into consideration when it comes to their bottom line, because they're going to have to cut a check for that.
Yeah, and going back to your point before of the cost to milk a cow, this is a cost that we hadn't calculated into this equation in the past. And so when you're in these conversations and when you have conversations with your colleagues about how they're helping producers walk through what is their base worth, what are the ways that they are coming to that dollar?
Depends on where your market is and what processor that you do ship to. It's hard to really come up. You kind of got to take a look at the other marketplaces that are out there and use them as an example as to, okay, if we're going to really put a value on this, what is that value?
So we've been walking through these four areas, Curtis, that you're having conversations with producers on a pretty regular basis right now when it comes to evaluating the opportunity to grow through taking on a second site, or even use that second site as a stage in a growth process at their home dairy in some cases. And we've talked about the financial feasibility side and what that looks like. We've talked about the seller's perspective, but let's also revisit one thing that you mentioned earlier in our conversation at the very beginning, and that was, if you're going to take on this second site, how's it really going to play out on the management side, on the people side, on the resources of human capital? And so take us through that. When you are having these conversations, this is a question you bring up when it comes to day-to-day management of that second dairy, and not just the second dairy, but also continuing to manage the home site as well. So what do those conversations look like for you?
You bet. So yeah, day-to-day management. Yeah, our dairy producers have phenomenal experience in running their farms. And quite frankly, if they have an opportunity to look at a second site or an expansion of some sort, it's probably fair to say that they've had some success in their day-to-day management on their farm. Now, when you take that and you have to duplicate that, again, whether it's a half mile away or a couple of states away, that's when the rubber meets the road and where management is really revealed on a dairy as to, can they physically do it. Things that need to get taken into consideration is the travel between the two sites. Not a lot of folks think about that right out. There's a cost to that. You have a person, two, three, four people in a vehicle of some sort, whether it be a tractor or a truck, going from one site to another. They're on the clock. Even if they're salary, they could be doing something different with their time. So now we've got a cost of physically going from one site to the other. And usually those folks that are traveling between two sites are our middle management or upper management. So they've got quite a bit of responsibility. But this is one of those areas where, when I talk about middle management, that our dairy producers now have to think about, because usually they have a head herds person, but they get to talk to them every day, or a head feeder, but they're talking to them every day because their boots are on the ground with them at that dairy. This middle management becomes extremely important because now, when the dairy owner themselves can't physically be there, they're going to have to rely on those middle management team to operate the dairy as if it were their own when you're not able to be right there on site. So uh, the day-to-day piece, it's not necessarily very easily to be duplicated. Say, you know what, we do it exactly like this here. We're going to do it the exact same over here. Your manure system might be different. The crops that you bring in might be different. The dairy facility layout, I guarantee, is going to be different. So it's hard to duplicate that. But again, middle management, they are a key factor into taking a look at a second site.
These conversations also may open up questions for employees or family members too about what is the bigger picture, what is the long-term plan of the dairy business. And so that is another thing that comes into these four key factors that we've been talking about today, Curtis: financial feasibility, the seller's perspective, handling day-to-day management, but that other piece to this puzzle that you are sitting at the table with and having conversations every day with your clients, and Compeer is doing at large as well, is what's next? What's the bigger picture? And how can producers think about the long game when it comes to these decisions? So what questions are you asking to help them articulate those long-term planning aspects of this picture?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic of conversation because there's a lot of other conversation, the other topics. You kind of have a roadmap per se a little bit. When we're looking at financial numbers, okay, we know how to calculate your cost of production. We know what your balance sheet looks like. Those roadmaps are kind of already laid out. But what might not be laid out is the big what's next question. Sometimes when you ask a dairy producer, hey, what's next? They say, this is next. This is the next step, which is a perfectly fine answer. And it is very true. But it's the rubbing the crystal ball. What's next after this one? Are you looking to acquire the third or fourth dairy? Are you looking to step out yourself at some point? Is there going to be a next generation that you have on board? And is that next generation family, or is it key employees that want to maybe take over the dairy? Is this site that you are looking at purchasing, what's the longevity of it? Does it need to have a bunch of money put into it, more capital investment to either expand it or to maybe modernize it and fix it up so that it can last longer? And when, what does that look like? There's great questions that can be asked as to what is next, but the big thing that our producers need to do is go, what's the 5, 10, 20-year plan down the road? Because we really need to think about it.
Mm.
And when they start to scratch their heads a little bit about, boy, I really don't know, you almost want to take them for a trip back in time and go, okay, now that you know where you are at today, let's go back 20 years and how you were operating your dairy. What would you have asked yourself then? And that usually helps shine a light on that topic of conversation because it's real for them, right? They maybe said, I never in a million years would have thought that I was going to be running two dairies or bringing my 500 cow herd to 1,000 cows or 1,000 cows to 20,000 cows. And those questions, that one question right there, really helps them kind of sit them back in their chair and go, okay, I really need to think about what is next because I need to plan accordingly for it.
Curtis, as we have this conversation today, it reminds me a lot of a conversation I actually had in my previous career as a magazine editor with your dad a few years ago. And so I'm recalling his words of when you guys were, a couple of miles down the road from where I live, milking cows in a tie stall barn, right? And that eventually became a partnership and a multi-site dairy business. And so you have your Compeer perspective, but this is a personal story that you've seen within your own family too.
It sure has. I still have that magazine article sitting in my desk at home, the one that you and my dad worked on. But yeah, my dad tells a phenomenal story of how his aspirations were to move and grow the dairy business. And when you look at the Breeze Dairy Group today and the successes that they've had, it really stems around the phenomenal partnerships that are at hand. Quite frankly, I believe, I'm almost 100% certain that the five families that came together on day one to start the initial dairy has not missed a monthly meeting in the 20 years that the Lake Breeze and Breeze Dairy Group has been in existence. And so that there is a true testament on having open conversations, being engaged on a regular basis, and having everybody at the table and talking frequently to further and better the dairy operation as a whole. There's been some success. There's obviously been some failures along the way too, but you learn from your failures, and that only makes you stronger as you move forward.
When you look at what that experience that's close to your home and close to your heart, anything else that you think has led that example of a multi-site growing dairy to have its own success? What else do you see there?
There's lots of different avenues to look at with the success of that operation. And it all stems from the very, very start and kind of setting some expectations. One thing that we really didn't talk too much on yet is your professional team outside of your day-to-day professional team, your nutritionist, consultants, veterinarian. It's kind of more of that legal professional team. It's the banker, the attorney, tax preparer, your accountant, and all of those need to align very, very well. And so when we talk about setting up an operation where there's partnerships or multi-families that are involved, having an attorney that understands the agricultural slash dairy world really well is extremely important. Because again, on day one, you really want to set those expectations so you know what stake everybody has at the table. And if something happens, there is a roadmap that you can look at to say, okay, in our agreements, this happened and this is how we were going to deal with it. And everybody's on the same page on day one.
Yeah, so expectations and clarity from the very beginning.
That's right. Yeah, it's so very important, and quite frankly, along the way, when Lake Breeze Dairy started, that's where I got my start in the dairy industry. Right after I was finished with college, went back home as a transition and calving manager, and absolutely miss it with my heart, but absolutely love what I do now, even so much better. But if you would have asked the partners of the Breeze Dairy Group then, would we be where we are today? No one really would have probably had that answer. We were looking at just the one site. So there was opportunities that came up along the way, and everyone was different, everyone was unique, and everyone had to take a step back, look at from an individual basis and say, okay, what does this mean for our group, our partners moving forward?
And so, Curtis, you sit at the table with producers every single day having these conversations, but the value you bring is in the fact that you've lived it and you've seen it firsthand and seen what it takes to be successful. And do you remember your dad had a plaque? He told me he had a plaque on his wall. What did it say?
Oh, yes, yes. Yep, there's a plaque that does say always moving forward, always looking ahead. Actually, my mom and dad received before our part, this is when we were milking in our tie stall barn, probably shortly after Grandpa had passed, and Mom and Dad won the Outstanding Young Farmers Award, and part of that award was to go down to Florida and take a trip. Back then in the early 90s, that's where a lot of the larger dairies were, kind of southern Georgia and northern Florida.
Yeah.
And my dad tells me a story about how they toured a dairy operation that was larger. When I say larger, I think it was probably 500 to 1,000 cows. And he came back home and said, boy, I really need to look at my dairy here to see what is next. What is the forward look on our operation? And he said that was kind of a pivotal moment in his life that made him take a step back and go, will I always be milking 60 cows in my grandpa's tie stall barn, or is there a future for us as the Gerrits family moving forward in the dairy industry?
Going to see a 500 cow dairy or 600 cow dairy 10xing the tie stall barn, right? Totally shifted his perspective and also has influenced the way that you are able to help your clients now because of those decisions and because you've seen the value of those important conversations, the value of evaluating financial feasibility, the value of having these conversations on the seller side, not just the buyer side, and what it takes from a management perspective and a long-term planning perspective. And so anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I guess maybe just to take everything and wrap it all up, my message to dairy farmers out there is when you have an opportunity, just to really make sure you dive into all of the arenas that are at the table. Again, going back to the financial feasibility piece, what's in it for the seller? That really can help you from a negotiation standpoint when you know what their motives really are. That really can help shape what you can and maybe can't offer when taking a look at a dairy. The third key piece there is the day-to-day management side of things. Is again, it's always exciting. It's human nature to look at something and go, "Hey, this is exciting. This is new. This is fun." But take a step back again and go, "How am I physically going to manage this on a day-to-day basis? Do I have the wherewithal? Because I'm now just doubling my workload, and can I physically do that from a dairy management perspective? And then lastly is it's the what's next. If this does come to fruition and we can move into the next opportunity, is what's the next opportunity after that? And quite frankly, those four things, keep those front of mind and it'll really help shape your decision making processes moving forward.
All right. Well, excellent. Well, Curtis, it's been a pleasure to have you as a guest on the Uplevel Dairy podcast today, sharing your wisdom and your experience and the conversations you're having every single day with dairy producers, sitting down at the table and helping them to be profitable, successful, and operate at a high level of excellence. Thanks for joining us, Curtis.
Thank you, Peggy. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Uplevel Dairy podcast. That was Curtis Gerrits from Compeer Financial. Compeer is a member-owned farm credit cooperative serving and supporting agriculture and rural America. Their dairy team brings world-class expertise and tailored solutions to support dairy producers' financial goals and lending needs. I'm Peggy Coffeen, and if you liked this episode, please take a moment to give it a 5-star rating and review on your favorite listening platform. And if you want to receive these episodes right in your inbox every time a new one comes out, be sure to head over to upleveldairy.com and subscribe to join the Uplevel Dairy community. I'm Peggy Coffeen, and thanks for listening to the Uplevel Dairy podcast.